So it is easily the closest election that the U.S. race to the White House is seeing in a generation. It is as tight as it gets between incumbent Vice President Kamala Harris, who's won the Democratic ticket, and former President Donald Trump, who's won the Republican ticket. So let's try and make sense of this. I'm now joined by Mr. Larry Sabato. He's with the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia, one of the preeminent political scientists in America, and also an election watcher and somebody who has got a knack of predicting who is likely to win the race to the White House. Thank you very much, Mr. Sabato, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. Kamala Harris, of course, seems to be leading nationally in most of the opinion polls that have come out, particularly on the popular vote. But in some of the battleground states, the gap seems to be narrowing, particularly in what's called the Great Lakes states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. How concerned would you be if you were at the Harris campaign right now, 3 weeks out from the election, with the gap seemingly narrowing?
They've always said that it would be close. In fact, Vice President Harris has called herself the underdog repeatedly. I don't know that she's the underdog. I think this is truly a dead even race, and I agree with the characterization that it's the closest since 2000, the race between George W. Bush and Al Gore. But look, the swing states are not representative of the country as a whole. Essentially, the swing states are a bit more conservative, a bit more Republican than the country as a whole. And this is all because of the electoral college system that we still have left over from 1789, back when we didn't have a popular vote at all.
So the so-called Great Lakes states, or the Blue Wall, the industrial Midwest, we checked back on the Democrats who went on to win the White House. No Democrat has won since Clinton in 1992, Barack Obama in 2008, Joe Biden in 2020 certainly. No Democrat who hopes to win the White House can win without winning all three of these states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And the fact that Harris last month, right after the debate, enjoyed almost a 3 percentage point lead in those states, and that now is down to just 1% in those three blue wall states. Again, how concerning would that be?
Absolutely. They're really not the blue wall anymore. They're a wall, but they're not very blue. They're competitive states, and they usually are decided by small margins, Pennsylvania in particular. So this is not unusual, but it means that the pressure is even greater on Vice President Harris to produce. Look, they don't have much of a margin for error, but Donald Trump doesn't either.
On the other hand, Mr. Sabato, the so-called Sun Belt states, Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, again, all of those states Trump seems to be leading in. I want to know your thoughts on whether the recent hurricanes there will have any impact on these states at all. But so far, the polling seems to show that Trump is leading in all of those states. Again, the reason why the 2020 election was so competitive was because Biden won both Georgia and Arizona. But do you see Harris being able to compete in any of these three states in a way to lessen her dependence on the blue wall or the Great Lakes states?
Well, they're already competitive. I would say Arizona is probably the most Republican leaning, even though Joe Biden won it 4 years ago, but he won it by a tiny, tiny sliver of the vote. And Arizona normally votes Republican, so that's not a surprise. And really, Georgia is much the same way. Biden barely won it. We all remember the famous call from President Trump to the Secretary of State in Georgia, requesting that he somehow find enough votes for Trump to actually win the state. Now, North Carolina is going to be interesting because of the recent hurricane. The western part of the state does have some Democratic vote concentrations, but mainly it's a Republican area. And there's such dislocation there. Many people have scattered. They're not even living where they normally are. It's not going to be easy for them to vote, even though the authorities are trying to make it easier. That could affect the final balance. North Carolina is usually won by Republicans by a point or two or three. Well, this could affect a point or two or three.
Now, one thing that we saw in 2016 as well was that Hillary Clinton, at this point of time, middle of October, in the campaign cycle, Hillary Clinton was leading Donald Trump by an average of 5 points in these battleground states and nationally too. And she, yes, won the popular vote, but she lost these three battleground states. She lost Michigan, she lost Pennsylvania, she lost Wisconsin. What are the chances that might happen again, that Harris wins the popular vote, as she's expected to because she's leading most of the polls nationally, but she ends up losing the Electoral College?
Oh, absolutely. That's the great fear among Democrats. And you're absolutely correct. There is a bias to the Republicans in the Electoral College. It varies from election to election. It can be a point, it can be 3 points, whatever the case may be. They don't line up. The Electoral College does not line up with the popular vote. But you can't really do a direct comparison with 2016 because the polls have been adjusted in various ways to take into account the fact that so many Trump voters were missed. Many of them wouldn't participate. They rebel against the establishment. They view the media polls as part of the establishment. But there have been ways that we found that do adjust the polling numbers. So these numbers are closer to reality. No one will know until after the election how close to reality.
So let's talk about demographics, and you would imagine that the strong suit for the Harris campaign would be votes of minority community, whether it is minority men or women. Women, of course, much more enthused by the Harris campaign. But is it concerning to the Harris campaign that Hispanic men and African American men are less enthused by her campaign, as let's say some of the black women and Hispanic women are? Is that a matter of concern?
Let me broaden it out. Women generally are very excited about Harris's campaign. Not all of them are voting for Harris, but she's winning a considerable majority of women. Men are voting for Donald Trump, just as they have done in two other presidential elections. And so men will end up supporting Donald Trump disproportionately. The question is, what is the balance? Right now, depends on which poll you look at. Women are supporting Harris to a greater degree than men are supporting Trump, though there have been some polling exceptions. I don't know that in the end the gender gap will be quite as big as it is now. Often the pre-election polls are exaggerated compared to what people do in the end, which is to follow their partisan identification. So we'll see. Now, as far as black men are concerned, I think that is being exaggerated. The last time black men supported Joe Biden overwhelmingly, and yet he got higher support from black women. That is the norm. Black men are inclined to be a little more Republican, but 80 to 85% of black men still vote Democratic. So we can exaggerate these things. The real threat for Kamala Harris is in the Latino vote, the Hispanic vote. That's where Republicans have been making significant gains in both men and women, but particularly men.
And on the two issues which Americans feel like matters most to them in this election cycle, one, of course, happens to be the state of the economy, and they have a very dim view. The average American has a very dim view of the state of the economy, their own sort of economic state compared to 4 years ago. The issue of immigration, which the Republicans have made a huge talking point in their campaign, both Trump and J.D. Vance's running mate. But on the issue of abortion, naturally, the Democrats feel more enthused. That's an issue that's working for them. The other two big issues, economy and immigration, how much of a concern is that?
Oh, I rate abortion, economy, and immigration at about the same level because you have to look beyond the poll numbers. You look to what actually moves votes. That's the only thing that matters at an election. So people think the economy is getting much worse. It is not. The objective data is quite contrary to that view, but it's what people believe that matters in elections. But that moves a certain number of voters, but actually immigration and the border moves more voters in a Republican direction than inflation does. And abortion is the best card that Kamala Harris has because women of all ages, even women who would not avail themselves of abortion services, they have daughters and granddaughters and friends, young women friends. And they are affected by the decision of the Supreme Court produced by Donald Trump. So these are all issues that will mix together and will move voters in large numbers. It is impossible to tell in advance how many will be moved for each of these matters.
And finally, Mr. Larry Sabato, I don't know if you're a betting man, but if you were to be a betting man, who would you put your money on to be the next president of the United States?
I would not bet my money. In fact, I'm prohibited by statute here from betting because of what I do. So I'm not allowed to bet, and I give the same answer to interviewers who ask me that question. That's a good question, but I'm not going to answer it.
All right, Larry Sabato from the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Thank you very much for your time, for your thoughts and
Very
insights.
good questions. Thank you.